Hello and welcome to the Department of Politics at the University of Liverpool. I'm Sam Ashenden, the current head of department, and it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Richard Gillespie, former head of Department of Politics at the University of Liverpool, former student at the University of Liverpool. Richard, welcome to this interview. I think we can say that you have experience across the range of our activities, having been an undergraduate student here and then a postgraduate student here, and then returning after a stint away as a member of staff and becoming head of department and only retiring in 2017. So my task with you in this interview, I think, is to try and elicit some of the richness of that multifaceted experience and some of the innovations that you made while you were here as a member of staff. For example, setting up and running the Europe in the World Centre with Professor Erica Harris. So maybe we could begin with you telling me a bit about how it was you came to Liverpool in the first place. What brought you to the University of Liverpool back in 1971?
I came originally to study law in 1970, and I think I'd put Liverpool was third on my list, and King's was top, strong law department. Manchester was second, Liverpool was third. I didn't get King's, I got the other two offers, but I preferred Liverpool to Manchester. And I think, both cities had a lot going for them, but I thought that Liverpool was perhaps the more vibrant city to be in. It also had the reputation for people who were friendly, humorous. I think that, along with the pop scene, the strength of the labour movement here as well, because I was becoming interested in labour politics and that sort of thing. So I came to study law. I did it for a full year. I found it a little bit boring, to be honest. There was a lot of very foundational teaching in Roman law and English medieval legal system, which was positively medieval. It wasn't a good year for me, really, I think, in terms of interest. At the same time, I was becoming more interested in politics and more active in politics. So, end of the first year, I walked over to the Roxby building and saw somebody in there who happened to be I think the politics admissions tutor then was a man called Robert Kilroy Silk, who later became Kilroy.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so a trajectory from law to politics.
Yes.
And choosing Liverpool for its vibrancy and so on, which I think many students would still regard as a kind of key reason to choose Liverpool in the present. It's interesting. Talking to first-year undergraduates this year, the city itself and the university, I think, still has that reputation. So you moved into the politics department as a student back in 1971. How was that then? What was it like being an undergraduate student in politics in the early 1970s? That was a time of enormous fractiousness in Britain, and you've mentioned the Labour Party and the politics. What was the politics of Liverpool and the politics of the department like for you as an undergraduate student?
The department then was called the Department of Political Theory and Institutions. I think it was probably the only one in the country with that title. Yes, that was its first incarnation. The department had about 12, 13 members of staff. I think initially all male. It was headed by Fred Ridley, who was, I think, the original head of department. It wasn't a particularly left-wing or right-wing department. It was fairly middle of the road. It was quite a traditional department. I mean, the title itself implies a lot of emphasis on political theory and a lot of emphasis on political institutions. There wasn't initially a lot of international politics. There was some Latin American, later on a bit of Africa, and so on. But it was fairly narrow in some respects, but there were a good range of options. I think this structure has remained that the first year provides something of a foundation, but after that, Liverpool's always been, I think, a department that's offered options right the way through the second and third year.
Yes.
And that was attractive because we had, along with things like Latin American or Central and Eastern European politics, Central and Eastern European came in about 1972, we had things like The Writer and Politics, Tony Beck talking about politically committed writers. And I really loved that because English literature had been one of my favourite topics at school. And then politically, well, this was the tail end of radicalism in Liverpool among the student body. There had been an occupation of Senate House, I think only the year before. The Roxby building was also occupied by politics students. That was in solidarity with students at the LSE.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what issue they had raised, but some of the issues were about British universities, but a lot of it here was about South Africa, because we had a Chancellor then, Lord Salisbury, who was a strong supporter of apartheid South Africa and had been, I think, associated with Rhodesia as well. Right. So among the student body, the concern was that there were investments, university investments, and students wanted to find out about them. That was the reason for the occupation of Senate House, which John Snow was involved in, for example. And the first demonstration that I went on in Liverpool, I think in December of that year, was because Lord Salisbury had been invited to some event at the university. And there was a torchlit demonstration down to the Adelphi Hotel where he was reputed to be staying. He tended to stay there when he came and visited. And yes, I remember that very strongly, people coming out on the balconies at the Adelphi and probably regarding us as light entertainment. But it's quite a dramatic demonstration.
Do you think that's changed significantly? I'm just thinking of recent protests of students in various cities across the UK and the transformation of the terms of being a student now compared with being a student then. Do you think that the experience is much different? Or I'm looking at the student protests now. Do you feel as though there's some continuity?
I think there's some continuity in that a lot of the protest is about local issues on the campus, but equally I think green issues in particular and some other causes are still mobilising students. And this comes in waves, I think, and but it doesn't roll across the whole campus. I remember that when Senate House was occupied, before I arrived here, there was also an attempt by medics and engineers to drive out the occupiers from Senate House. So there was quite a lot of polarisation on the campus then. And but apart from that, I think the university became a bit more subdued in the next few years. And there were still the usual politics societies in the Students' Union. I became chair of the Labour Club in the union, but there was also a socialist society to the left of us, and there was Tories and Liberals and so on.
And you went from being an undergraduate student seamlessly into being a postgraduate student? Yes,
I went straight from being an undergraduate to being a research student.
Right.
Because my degree was good enough to do that, to make that leap. And the advice I had from my tutors was just doing an MA wasn't worth it in terms of if you want to become an academic, it wouldn't really add a lot of value. So I made that little leap, but remained in Liverpool from 74 when I graduated.
Right. And what was your thesis about?
My thesis was about the left wing of the Peronist movement in Argentina. So it was about radical currents within the historical populist movement of Peronism in Argentina. And Peronism had been radicalized to some extent after Perón was deposed in 1955. Some of the younger supporters of the movement in particular were influenced by the Cuban Revolution and organized urban guerrilla movements. So I wanted to see what had brought about this radicalization and look at the strategies of these groups that were working within this broader movement.
Right. And is this work then that ended up in the books about Cuba and about Peronism that you published?
It led initially. I received my PhD in '79, and immediately moved on to write a more focused book about the main guerrilla movement, the Montoneros, which was published very expensively here by Oxford University Press, so it didn't make a huge impact beyond academia. But in Argentina, after the military regime fell, it became a bestseller. So I had that strange existence for a while that I was very well known in Argentina, nowhere else. And yes, that was my first big book, I guess, and probably the one that's most widely known internationally.
I'm going to come back to that, but first of all, to sort of connect your own experience of being a student and then the experience of coming back as a lecturer, are there things that you think have been distinctive about Liverpool students that have informed how you have taught? Are there things that, what's your experience been of teaching Liverpool students and how's that reflected?
I think there's a long-term impact from teaching students, but you start off in a fairly improvised way, at least at that time, because there's no training of lecturers, and certainly for my first lectureship in Newcastle, 1 year lectureship in Latin American Studies, I just went straight in and was expected to lecture. And so you just followed what you had found in your own department, where the approach was fairly traditional, really 50 minutes, 60 minutes even of talking, made all the usual mistakes of trying to put too much into the lectures and went too fast and so on. But I think that you kind of iron out in the first year. You find out what works for the students. But I think longer term, I learnt from students in terms of what their real interests were. The conventional way of teaching Latin American politics, or later Spanish politics, was to look at it as a political system in a fairly centralised way. So you look at the different institutions, the political parties, the competition, electoral system, interest groups. But increasingly I found that there was greater student interest in social movements and things that connected a little bit more with students' own lives. And that certainly affected the content of the courses that I taught, and it tended to have more of a bottom-up content after a while. And in Spain, for example, I took a big interest in Podemos and the more radical, the new things that were happening. And perhaps played down some of the history, made it more contemporary.
So is your interest in, or was your interest in Latin America originally more driven by, and maybe it's a false question, but more driven by the Spanish language or by an interest in dictatorship, or an interest in is it I'm interested in how you move from Latin America, or what apparently looks like a move from Latin American politics to the Iberian Peninsula. And how is it just that you're coming home and from Latin America there is Spain on the way back to Liverpool, or is it that actually the interest is the Spanish language and politics in the Spanish language, or?
Certainly wasn't the Spanish language.
Okay.
When I arrived in Argentina, I couldn't understand a word because there was really very little preparation for this. I can remember going into the Latin American Studies Centre for a few lessons for beginners in Spanish, and it was all about stories about Pedro and his donkey and things like that. It was also very much with a Spanish accent, and Argentinian Spanish is considerably different, and a lot of Italian influence and so on. So I really struggled with the language initially. I think, I chose Argentina because I was politically committed myself. I was interested in radicalisation. I was part of the radical wing of the Labour Party at that time. I think I found the lectures of my Latin American politics teacher, Walter Little, quite inspiring. Obviously, he was an expert on Argentina.
Yeah.
So it was logical that if I wanted to stay here, that would be a good topic. And I was particularly interested. I was in the Labour Party Young Socialists at that time, and they were trying to push Labour to the left.
Yes. And
the groups within Peronism were trying to take over the movement really and steer it in a much more pro-Cuban direction.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure that they could do it, but I just found it fascinating that they were operating in this broader movement and were trying to transform it. And there were lots of different aspects there in terms of the armed struggle.
Yeah.
But yes, I sometimes think that project would never have been allowed today because we didn't have a research ethics committee. And I'm sure they would have had something to say about somebody going out there at that time when the political situation was deteriorating. And within a week of me arriving, there was a general strike. 6 months later, the Air Force tried to launch a coup, fascist inspiration. And 3 months later, the armed forces took over and unleashed a reign of terror. So it was a steep learning curve.
How close to all of that did you find yourself?
Well, I remained there for a good 6 months after the coup. I had a lot of very sensitive material that would have been regarded by the authorities as subversive and so on. There were times when the military was organising house-to-house raids and things like that. On one occasion, they came very close to my street. They stopped one street short.
Right.
I got a phone call warning me that they were heading in my direction. So I had to resort to contacts in the British Embassy, in fact, to get that material out.
So how did you get that material out?
Well, I went to see my contacts, spooks basically. I wasn't initially aware that they were spooks, but they were. I went to see them and said, look, there was a raid near my house last night. If it continues tonight, you're going to have a problem, not just me. And
so help me.
Fortunately, they helped me, and they sent a jeep round with a couple of big, heavy guys, and they stopped in the street outside, and they came up and took a whole load of boxes out.
And you?
Not me, no. I stayed, and I had to still... I was still acquiring material after that. So I had a bit of a scary journey to the airport on my final day.
I should think so.
Yeah.
So were you visited by your supervisor in all this time?
I was. I mean, he came. There were two of us there, two research students. A guy called Tony Powell, who's been a lifelong friend. He was studying the military, and I was studying the subversives. Yes. Sorry, the question.
So was whether you had visits from your supervisor?
Yes. Sorry.
And
Yeah.
how you
Yeah.
finally made it out?
Yeah. Walter came out. He was doing a bit of research on elections, and I don't think he'd realised how bad the situation was. He was visibly shaken when we talked to him about it. He interviewed us while we were there. He debriefed us, we spoke about the progress of the thesis. So we got some feedback, which we hadn't really had. We were largely there for a long, long time, basically on our own.
Yeah.
And survived it. So it's a good experience to have had.
Absolutely.
At the
Character
time,
forming.
Yeah.
Yeah. Once you've got out and survived, yeah. And so by the time you returned to Liverpool, having spent a year in Newcastle as a young lecturer, you'd had quite a lot of formation in different places. I'm just trying to kind of place you in...
Yeah, briefly, a year in Newcastle, job came to an end. I was unemployed for 6 months, which was of great benefit because I finished my thesis in those 6 months. I think I wrote 4 chapters in 4 months, just going at it furiously.
Yeah.
So that was finished, and that enhanced my chances of getting other jobs. I then went from the Dole Queue to St John's College in Oxford as a junior research fellow in politics. I used that in order to start working on Spain, to diversify my portfolio, so that I could teach other things as well. That got me into more European politics equally. Early 80s were very difficult for finding jobs. There was an actual freeze, government freeze on university posts.
Yes.
And the only thing I could do after St John's came to an end was return to Newcastle, because there was a university fellowship going there. And that allowed me to, again, in what seems to be adversity at the time, it had a silver lining, because I was able to write up a lot of research that I'd done in Spain using the JRF post at St John's.
Right.
So I wrote the second big book on the Spanish Socialist Party then. And then, I have to say, I owe my first permanent job to Margaret Thatcher. Because she devised a scheme of new blood lectureships. And I think there were maybe 12 across the country in all subjects. And Warwick managed to get one in politics of Southern Europe.
Aha.
So using my Spanish card, I managed to get that.
So you moved to Warwick.
I moved to
from
Warwick.
Newcastle.
I was there for about 7 or 8 years. And then a chair came up at Portsmouth, which was in a very different context of languages and area studies.
Right.
And so I went down and got that, and was there for 6 years, which is... they were very good years, actually, because they had a policy in Portsmouth of devolving resources to units of assessment for research. And because we did very well, we got lots of funding.
Resources.
So we could actually start building things there. Eventually the main chair at Liverpool came up, and that's what I came for in the end.
So you returned to Liverpool as a professor of politics.
In 2000, yes.
In the year 2000.
Yeah.
And then stayed here until retiring in 2017.
Indeed, yes. Yes,
Okay.
and was head of department from 2004 to 2008.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so coming back to Liverpool then, and that experience, how did when you arrived back in Liverpool in 2000, what was the year 2000 like in Liverpool, and what was the department like, and who were the colleagues, and how did things go along?
Department was different by then. It was part of a school of politics and communication studies.
Mm-hmm.
I think the university had merged politics because it was rather small in terms of politics departments elsewhere in relation to them. And we were merged with communication studies. There was some rationale for it in that there were people like Dennis Kavanagh, Neil Gavin, and one or two others who were political communications experts. But then, of course, there were others who didn't fall into that, both on the communication studies side and on the politics side. So there was that tension, that division. There was also a divide, a generational divide. There was talk at that time about new Liverpool and old Liverpool, mimicking the Labour Party divide at the time. There were tensions, I think, because some of the older members of staff were not producing as much as they had earlier. It was still scholarly and so on, but they weren't publishing as much. But the new appointees were much more prolific, and they felt they were being held back, basically, by the others. I think that division resolved itself through retirements. But the other one was difficult. We struggled with it for several years. And the point is that even as politics and communication studies, we were only 12, 13. It was still a very small unit.
Yes. And
that harmed us when it came to research assessment exercises. Because the assumption of the politics panel was that if you're a small department, you couldn't possibly have a research culture. And they were looking for evidence of that.
Yes.
The numbers counted against us. And also the fact that we had people from communication studies that on some occasions we all presented our research to the one politics panel.
Yeah.
And we were a little bit at their mercy to see whether they would cross-refer to the communications panel. One year they didn't. And they obviously didn't see any value in what the communications people were doing.
Yes.
And that, plus the fact that we were a very small department, meant that we had a poor result.
So the exigencies of what was the RAE, Research Assessment Exercise, and became the REF, the Research Excellence Framework, and I can't remember what it is now.
No.
Those things kind of drove institutional change, you would say.
I think so, very much. Very much. The university was looking for ways of getting strength across the board, and one way that they saw as doing that would be, merging, putting us into a different configuration with history or sociology or something, or even closing small departments. That was actually discussed at one time, and there was a bit of a struggle over that, which fortunately we won.
And how was that won?
That was won by us obviously arguing our case, showing our potential, showing what we had done. I think one thing that changed while I was head was that we expanded our postgraduate numbers quite significantly. I think we had just a general MA politics, but we didn't have a programme. And I think by the end of it we had 2 programmes in European politics and in international politics. So things like that, and yes, we got 1 or 2 new posts, but we've probably had a whole decade of struggling to rebuild before the national boom for politics in the 2010s.
Yes.
When the case was clear that the department had to expand to take advantage of it.
Yeah. And how did the Europe and the World Centre come about? What was the inspiration for that?
I had set up a European Studies Centre in Portsmouth because I needed there to bring together researchers from languages and area studies, and that was quite a good way of doing it. And there in the RAE we had entered under European Studies. The previous result had been a 2 out of 5. We went straight to a 4, went then to a 5. So I had some relevant experience, and then here in the early years there was Andrew Geddes, who is obviously a noted expert on European migration studies. He was keen on the idea as well, and my idea was that here we should have a European Studies Centre that would be looking out as well as looking at Europe. Hence the name Europe in the World Centre, which was kind of a bit of a play on words. And it enabled us to look at European external relations, which I was quite interested in myself, and relationships with USA or other parts of the world, China, etc. And we had the opportunity through EU membership of going for John Monnet funding. We managed to get that, so we became a John Monnet Centre of Excellence. That brought in funding, which we could use to put into postgraduate bursaries, seminars, conferences. That went very well. Andrew subsequently moved to Sheffield University, but others came along, especially Erica Harris, and later I was co-director with Erica.
Right, and the centre is still going strong and has just joined a new Centre of Excellence, Monet Centre of Excellence with Manchester.
Yeah,
so
that's a very good idea.
Yeah.
Yes, to have a partner there.
Yes, absolutely. So tell us more about, you've told us quite a lot about the sort of changes overall. Were there particular things that afflicted you or made your life easier when you were head of department? I'm interested in this one as the incoming head of Department of Politics.
Oh.
What was that experience like?
It started very badly, to be honest. Because I managed to defer being head of department for 4 years. But the day gradually arrived, and I thought I'd start well, so my wife and I went on a holiday to Menorca. But when I was there, I received a phone call saying there's a bit of a situation here. And at that time, the department had 4 secretaries. Professional services support services were organised on a different basis then. We had departmental secretaries. But this phone call was to tell me that we no longer had 4, but we had 1.
Oh.
Because one had taken sort of permanent sick leave. Another one had been accused by a 3rd secretary of taking money from the petty cash or something like that. There was a huge personality clash, I think, involved as well. But I came back from Menorca and we only had 1. And this was my start. And the summer months can be quite busy, as you probably know, in terms of filling out reports on the previous year, which you're very reliant on experienced secretaries for, and preparing for the new arrivals and so on. So it started very, very badly.
You were thrown
and it
into
got
it.
better.
And it got better. So, and what do you think was your most significant achievement in the time that you were head? What would you say?
I think probably the shift in balance between undergraduate and postgraduate. I think
Right.
that was the most
Mm-hmm.
significant thing. Our research student numbers increased as well.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I think we were on a good trajectory for those two things.
Yes.
And we had also the European cluster was working well.
Mm-hmm.
But there were still lots of challenges.
Mm-hmm.
And we were still a Department of Politics and Communication Studies by the time I finished.
Right.
I think it changed to become a Department of Politics more or less at the time I handed over to John Tung.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But that split meant that we were down in numbers again to about 8.
Yeah.
And that's when there was the really difficult
Small.
discussion.
Yeah.
But what was very positive there was the support we received from the students.
Right.
We didn't go looking for it. We began simply by sort of arguing the case in meetings with senior colleagues. But eventually there was a meeting of Senate where I can remember, in those days all professors attended Senate.
Mm-hmm.
And it was no longer in Senate House. We were meeting in the Victoria building, which is I think my favourite part of the university. And I can remember going along to that meeting. John Tung was primarily there to defend the department, but Erica and myself as the other two professors at the time. And we were met by hundreds of students outside who just mobilised independently. And they gave us a fantastic welcome. And then again, when we came out, I mean, we just felt like rock stars. And we were all really moved by it because it showed that they really cared about the department, and this was a struggle for them as well. I think that influenced the university because it was up against something here that was not just a simple argument within a group of professors.
So would you say that the department's relationship with its students was a strong one, obviously, but how much interaction was there between staff and students through that period of time? Were there regular social events, and what were the extracurricular things that sort of stand out for you through that period of time?
I think there were staff-student liaison committee meetings. We functioned very well at that level. I think the department has always found a lot of time for its students. That's always been a priority, even as research came much more up the agenda. That was very positive. I don't think we've found a lot of time for extracurricular activities with the students. That had existed a little bit back in the 70s, sort of staff-student cricket, that sort of thing. But I don't think, I think we had lost that. And I think it was, I don't know, I think there was a phase when everybody was very strongly focused on just trying to improve our research position. But that wasn't at the expense of the attention we gave to our students. I think office hours, things like that, being available by email and so on, that's always been a very strong part of the Liverpool department.
I've heard some interesting things in the time I've been here about what happens on election night in the Department of Politics. Were you ever involved in the election night?
I think I might have been involved a bit in the drinking or something later on. I think, yes, John Tung, Stuart Wilkes-Heague were very much involved in that. I don't think I was that involved. I think it was more the British politics people. Whereas, I was probably more interested in the Spanish elections.
We're doing the same thing for Spanish elections. Okay. Are there any moments across this time, this long time spent in Liverpool, that you'd really rather forget, but which bounce back at you every now and again?
Well, I think that meltdown of the secretarial support, I'd rather not I'd rather not repeat that. Yeah, I think that's probably the main thing. But other things, I think you just say, well, we just move on, and you take reverses. There are low spots collectively, really, or individually, or whatever. But I think there is a record of achievement, and for a long time it's gradual. But then, as I said, 2010 saw that great advance of the department and the great growth, some of the foundations for which had been laid earlier.
Yeah.
And
through this period of time, you're continuing to work on Spain, because then you publish in 2015 a book contesting Spain, and then in 2022 a book on Catalonia and Scotland. So obviously did your research focus basically become Spain through that period?
It did, yes. Latin America slipped a bit more into the background, certainly by the 90s. By the time I moved here, because I was told I wasn't required to teach Latin American politics here, that they were far more interested in me teaching Spain and Europe and becoming head and that sort of thing. So those were the priorities. And because I hadn't been researching in Latin America for a long time, that was a logical transition to make.
Yes.
But I'm still very much focused on Latin America. I'm writing a memoir at the moment, which is about Latin America and about the 1970s.
So has there been a return journey to Latin America?
Yes, I think the journey's carried on. I mean, Latin America's always been part of the journey. I've always been involved in some way with Latin America, whether it's been through lecturing, through Latin American solidarity groups, through Amnesty International groups that looked at Latin America, through marriage to a South American, and through friendships and contacts. So what I'm doing now is focusing through a memoir on something that's much more personal.
Yes.
I've always wanted to write a personal account of my experiences in Argentina, and I never felt that I could afford the time. I couldn't use it for my research assessment or anything like that. But now in retirement, I'm able to do that.
And do you have contemporaneous notes that do you still have those notes that the two big guys came and got and created?
I still have them in my attic. Yes, yes. I've still got an archive. I have donated a lot of books and some papers to libraries and so on, but I still got quite a lot of things that I can't part with. And I've also got, fortunately, every letter that I wrote to my parents from Argentina, which they kept.
Yes.
So that's a fantastic resource to jog the memory.
Absolutely.
And I'm still friends with the people who were with me from Liverpool in Argentina, Tony Powell and his family. So we sometimes talk about the good old days.
So the journey has not been a one-way journey. It's been more of a circling back and forth. Yes.
I have been back once to Argentina. I'm hoping to go in November this year to Uruguay and Argentina. Yes, it's still. I've been to Cuba again. I've been twice to Cuba.
Right.
So I continue to combine those interests with Spain. And Spain has also been a journey in itself.
Yes.
Because I started off there looking at the Spanish political system, looking at Spanish domestic politics, and then became interested in its external relations, which took me into Europe and the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
And then finally, as you referred to some of the more recent books, I've been looking at Spain from a much more decentralised perspective, and doing research in the Basque Country and in Catalonia. I think really you can only understand Spain as a plurinational entity, a bit like the UK in some respects, in that it's a unitary state but strongly with substantial devolution.
Yes.
And pressures from some of the regions through their claims to nationhood.
Yeah. So have you been learning Basque in your spare time?
Not been learning Basque, no, but I made some good contacts in the Basque Country, did lots of interviews there. I found that the fact that when I explained that my name was Gillespie and that it's Gaelic, then they didn't need any further hint. I didn't have to say I was Scottish. I'm in fact born in Wigan, but I sometimes use that, and it goes down very well in the Basque Country. But I think, yes, I've greatly enjoyed doing research there, and in Barcelona more recently.
So it continues. Very good.
It does, yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, we look forward to the memoir. I'm looking forward to the memoir.
Yes. Well, I hope I find a publisher for it. But
I'm sure you will.
I'm already halfway there. So, there'll be a lot about Liverpool and about the department. And so. Very
good. Well, thank you for joining us today. It's been great talking to you about your work and about the University of Liverpool and the Department of Politics over a long period of time. We're delighted to have been able to invite you back, and we look forward to more from you, and we look forward to inviting our other alumni back into the building as well. If you'd like to follow the Department of Politics, we are at LivUniPol on X, otherwise known as Twitter, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye for now.